watches, I don't know, Fitbits make noise. Basically, it beeps. If you would please shut them off. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. David D. Clark is a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab and a leader in the design of the internet. In designing an internet, David Clark explains how the internet is actually put together. Not, was it Ted Stevens? It's not a series of tubes. It's not a dump truck. But how it's actually put together, what requirements it was designed to meet, and why different design decisions would create different internets. Josephine Wolff is assistant professor in the Public Policy Department and Computer Security Department at Rochester Institute of Technology. She is a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and a fellow at the New America Cybersecurity Initiative. Her new book, You'll See This Message When It Is Too Late, The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches, examines a series of cybersecurity breaches from 2005 to 2015, the patterns that emerge from them, and what we can learn in their wake. We are very pleased to have them both with us. Please join me in welcoming David D. Clark and Josephine Wolff.
So we thought what we would do is each of us would talk about our book for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll give ourselves a little time to have a conversation, and then we'll have questions. And so is there anything we need to say before we dive right in here? Right.
Go for it.
The origin of my book, the immediate origin of my book, was the project that the National Science Foundation funded to get the network research community to ask what the internet of 15 years from might look like. And the charge to the research community was, don't think about migration, don't think about incremental steps, just fantasize a network of 15 or 20 years from now. And I had a role in that project to look across all of the things that were funded and try to integrate, and I started trying to figure out how to integrate, and I realized about halfway through somebody told me I was writing a book. It was sort of a oh shit moment, and I'd never written a book before. So part of the book is about the design of the internet, and it's got my rather personal history in it. It's rather idiosyncratic. Part of it is about alternative designs of an internet. I went back through the literature. It's not just the projects in the Future Internet project from NSF that I wrote about. I went back, and in fact, since about 1990, academics have been writing papers that said, well, you could have done it this way. And the interesting thing about that is not that they were trying to do what the internet does better. They actually had a sense that it should have done something different, which takes you into a space of what problem are you trying to solve. We have conversations about requirements, and most computer scientists get bored as soon as you say the word requirements. They say, oh my God, I just want to show you some cool tech. Let me show you this neat thing. I say, well, what's it for? But when I started writing about requirements, I realized this, with respect to the internet, is fascinating because there's this tension between the way engineers, classic computer science engineers, think about an internet. We are, by training, a performance discipline. I say cynically that the way you get your paper in the conference is the curve goes up. And so they want to go faster, they want to do more efficient, and in some respects they want to do a better job. But there are many other lenses through which you can use to look at the internet. And so there are a series of chapters in here on different requirements, and some of them are what a computer scientist would talk about, which is, well, maybe the internet should have tried to do something different. I'll give you one example in my time. And some of them have nothing to do with technology at all. There's a chapter in here on economic viability. How do you design a system that actually survives in the commercial world or in the marketplace? Or maybe the internet shouldn't. Maybe it should have been built by the governments. We could argue about that. And I'll come back to economics in a little bit. There's a chapter in here on security. There's a long chapter in here on security. We could have a conversation for about 5 hours about security here. There's a chapter on availability, which I would include in security, but it's important enough I gave it its different chapter. A couple of sort of technical chapters, like why is it the internet so hard to manage? That probably doesn't mean anything to you unless you've tried to figure out why the network in your own house is broken. In which case you really immediately realize the internet is terrible at telling you why it's broken. there's a chapter in here on how to build a system that lasts a long time. And the internet's actually fairly old. I have a few computer artifacts around that are a little older. Unix is a few years older, but most of them since then have come and gone. And just as an illustration, there are two theories. I have a chapter in here, I think identified about 20 theories of longevity, and I put them down and compared the two of them. It's a sort of, well, you could think about it this way or think about it this way kind of chapter, but here are two competing arguments about how to build a system that lasts a long time. And one argument is, well, requirements change, so your system has to be very plastic. You have to be able to change it. So the essence of a system that lasts a long time, it's its adaptability. That sort of makes good sense. And then you go talk to people in the business, go and say, no, you got the whole wrong idea. A system that lasts a long time is a system that's stable, because the internet is a platform. And don't forget, when I say internet, I'm not talking about Facebook. That's just an app. To you, that may be the internet, because that's the internet experience. But to me, the internet's this thing that moves data. We put it in packets, and you put the packet in here, and it comes out here. It's very simple. That's all it does, right? You put the packet in here, and it comes out there, except when it doesn't. We call that best effort service. Make no guarantees. Critical the system be allowed to fail. If you designed it so that it never failed, that's on a fool's errand. But never mind, that's a digression. So it's a platform, and the apps sit on top of it. You're trying to entice application designers. The last thing you want to do is keep changing the platform. Say, oh, damn, I have to rewrite my code. You just changed the platform. Do that. Stabilize the platform. And the more application designers you get, the more they demand the platform be stable. So you get into this lock-in where they love you, but they force you not to change. But there's this other point of view that says requirements change, so you have to be able to change. So how do you resolve the 10? Anyway, I have 25 theories of longevity. I want to give you one illustration about why computer science doesn't necessarily think about this the right way. Then I'm going to let Josephine talk about her book, and then we can have a little conversation. Computer scientists love features, and they love to add capabilities to systems. The internet was a very simple system, and it set out to do a very simple thing. You put the packet in here, and it comes out there except when it doesn't. How's that as a functional spec? Okay. But people looked at it and said, well, we could do better. We could do better. In fact, the tendency to do better the second time around is so well understood in computer science, we have a term for this. It's called second system syndrome, where you build a system and it does something pretty good, and it says, wow. And so the next time around, you try to build a system that does everything really well, which is a complete disaster, and you usually have to kill the project. So that second system syndrome usually leads to death. So people have come around and said, well, you know, there are a lot of things we could have added to the functionality of the internet. I'll give you one example. The internet has absolutely no idea about what you're doing. It's got an address on the front of the packet. You put the packet in, it comes out. If you don't put a packet in, it doesn't come out, right? It doesn't know what you're trying to do. Now, to us, that was a virtue. I don't want the network to know what I'm doing. I'm not trying to empower censors. I'm not trying to empower people who want to filter my behavior. But people said, you know, only geeks send packets for the fun of it. Real people send packets. I send packets for the fun of it. There's a box in my house. It's a little Raspberry Pi, and all it does is send packets all day, right? Because I'm measuring the internet, but that's weird. Yeah, that's what the box is that's down on the first floor. It's the little box that sends packets. And my wife is sitting back there laughing at me. But why don't we tell the network what you're doing? Because if the network knew what you're doing, it might be able to do a better job. So they said, well, most people want to get to a service, like an application, like Facebook. But Facebook is lots of places around the internet. So instead of putting the address of a machine, why don't you just put Facebook in the front of the packet? So get me to Facebook. Or maybe you're trying to retrieve some information, like you'd like to get today's New York Times. Why don't you put today's New York Times in the front of the packet? I'm grossly simplifying what these proposals do. And the network will say, oh, he wants to get the New York Times. I know how to do that. Well, their attitude was, the reason you do that is because the network can do a more efficient job of delivering the data, because we tend to focus on efficiency. And my reaction to these schemes, and I'm really interested in these schemes as research projects, but my reaction to them was not technical. My reaction was, wait a minute, who do I want to be in control of where my packets go? If I say, hey, network, deliver this packet to Facebook, I have given the network, which is to say actors like Comcast and AT&T and their kin overseas, I've given them control over which Facebook we pick. Today, Facebook has control over which Facebook you pick. Allocation of function is allocation of power. And And we look at internet service providers today, and you say, do I want to give them more power? Do I want to give them more control over what my experience is? Or do, in fact, I want to have that experience move up in the layers to the application or to the user? Computer scientists are not trained to think about modularity as allocation of power. But in fact, in something with as strong a set of social consequences as the internet, that really turns out, I think, to be the more design criteria than optimization. And there's a lot in this book about that kind of stuff. The last chapter, -1, the last chapter is sort of like my own musings about the future, but the chapter before that is titled How to Build a Network That's Fit for the Needs of Society. And that's where you get mushy concerns to come up. Mushy in the sense I don't know how to quantify them, not to say they're not important, like privacy. Okay, it's this aspirational thing, but what would it mean to reduce that to technology and which layer is responsible for it? So there's a lot of discussion in here about requirements. There's a lot of discussion in here about alternative ways of building an internet. There's a little bit of personal history, some of my own experiences. If we have time, I can tell you a few stories. And then there's a little bit of musing about the future. So that's my synopsis of my book. And you can talk about the synopsis of your book.
Okay. It's so great to be here, and such a thrill for me to be here with David, who is my graduate advisor, and all of the things that I worked on this book I first started thinking about and working on while I was studying with him here at MIT. And one of the things you learn when you study with David is that he is incredibly good at thinking and talking and writing about the internet and about computer networks in very general, high-level terms. Right? He just told you what some of the chapters in his book are about: security, availability, how do you create an internet that serves the purposes society wants. And when you see somebody do that really well for several years, you start to understand when you're a person who can't think on those high-level, really general terms as well. So my book is organized around very specific case studies because I understood my limitations. And I'm going to talk very briefly about one of them in particular, which is also a case study that you write a little bit about in your security chapter, which is a Dutch certificate authority named DigiNotar. A certificate authority is a company that issues digital certificates, and those certificates are the things that help you know when you load a web page, is this really the web page you think you're going to, that help you determine when you get an encryption key to communicate with somebody online, this is actually their public encryption key that I should be using. So they serve a hugely important role that a lot of people aren't very aware of or don't understand, because most of us don't manage our own certificates very actively in this space. And in 2011, a very well-respected certificate authority, that is to say a certificate authority that all of the major browsers trusted in their root, was compromised really severely. And what happens when a certificate authority gets compromised is, or what happened in this case at least, somebody got into their super secure servers, right? So for servers that you had to do a handprint reading to get into the room where they operated, and then insert a physical key card into the computer to actually initiate the issuing of these certificates, somebody managed to get through all those layers of security and issue what we call rogue certificates, which is to say real certificates that were actually signed by DigiNotar, but which the company had not meant to issue, for websites like CIA.gov, for Google.com. And we don't know everything that these certificates were used to do, but we know, because of the investigation that came after, that they were used to intercept and redirect people in Iran who were trying to access their Google accounts for some several 100,000 Iranian internet users. And I think this is an interesting case study for a lot of reasons, partly because it focuses on an intermediary, the certificate authority, that we don't always think or talk a lot about when we read about breaches in sort of everyday news and think about who's responsible for security. What comes after, and a lot of my book is really focused on that question of, after we discover a breach, what happens when we all stop thinking about it, when it leaves the headlines? And in that particular case, we see this struggle back and forth between the certificate authorities who are issuing these certificates and the browser manufacturers, right? The Googles, Microsofts, Mozillas, who are issuing the major browsers that we all use, and who need the certificate authorities, because without certificate authorities, browsers don't know whether the keys that they're receiving are actually the keys they want, whether the websites they're loading are in fact the correct websites, but also are in charge of vetting those certificate authorities, who in turn are in charge of vetting all of the people they're issuing certificates to. And there's this sort of power struggle back and forth between the browsers trying to impose new security measures, which you talk a little bit about. Certificate transparency is one of them, certificate pinning is another. These ways of sort of trying to impose new practices for the certificate authorities, and the certificate authorities mostly agreeing to do the things that the browser manufacturers impose on them, but with some negotiation and with some sort of continued fighting among the different actors who we think of as helping to keep us safe online. And so a lot of my book is about sort of in the aftermath, when the dust settles, especially for incidents like the DigiNotar compromise, where we never find out who's responsible. And there are a lot of theories related to the Iranian government and other things, but nobody's ever actually arrested or even charged for that particular incident. So the sense that you're going to go and catch who's responsible and put them in jail and sort of resolve things that way is often taken out of the equation in these stories. And a lot of the frustration and a lot of the sort of how do we move forward, how do we do better, comes down to infighting between these different kinds of intermediaries, like in this case, certificate authorities and browsers. And my interest is really around the question of which pieces of this do we think each of those groups of stakeholders are best equipped to deal with, are best suited for? How do we sort of think about a world in which all of the different pieces of that ecosystem can support and incentivize each other's security measures, as opposed to one in which they're all busy blaming each other and suing each other or trying to make it the other one's problem to implement better security. So I spend a fair bit of time in that case and in others trying to think about who's actually ends up paying for this. In the DigiNotar case, DigiNotar goes out of business after it's taken over by the Dutch government briefly. So they end up, pretty clearly bearing the brunt of that. But in a lot of other cases, there are fairly extended, drawn-out lawsuits, and a lot of money changes hands. And trying to understand sort of how we set up the incentives in a way where the people who are really in a position to do security well are actually the ones who have the incentives to do it. And if not, how might we use policy to change that? How might we think about what role the different application designers have in trying to design their applications in ways that will empower the organizations that use them or the individual users that use them to tailor their own security to it? And I think sort of when I think about some of the overlap there, both of us have an interest in this question of what is the right either architectural layer of the internet to think about different types of security or group of stakeholders to think about different elements of security, and how do you distribute it sort of in a way that makes sense and is actually meaningful. So I'm going to stop there and let us talk for a little and then perhaps take some questions.
There are wonderful case studies in this book, and I find this story about DigiNotar particularly fascinating. They claimed, although there's some argument, to be a very secure facility. But it's also the case when you're attacked by what might have been a state intelligence service, like the Iranian intelligence. We don't know. I mean, maybe it was some lone hacker, but I have my doubts, but that's just speculation. But in a situation like this, it's possible people died. And I once said the internet hasn't killed anybody yet. And when you start dealing with state agencies working against dissidents and activists, you're playing for keeps. And it's a serious space to mess around in and get wrong. So the case studies are delightful, but the last part of the book is dealing with a really important issue, which is who's responsible for different parts of the problem. And I'd like to just elaborate on that just a little bit. We use the word security in sort of an aspirational way. Everybody, if I said, would you like the internet to be more secure, is there anybody here who would disagree with me? But that's an aspiration. That's not an actionable statement. It doesn't actually mean anything. You have to find a way of unpacking the security challenge into parts. And the book has a theory about how to do that. We could argue about whether it's a good partition of the problem, but I like to talk about the trade-off of two issues in this space. And one of them is, you and I want to have a secure conversation. So we are going to do all kinds of things to make sure that people can't spy on us. So at that point, the cryptographers come in and they say, oh, we'll encrypt it and then everything's fine. Everything's fine, except for an aphorism I was taught by a counterintelligence friend of mine who said, only amateurs think you have to break the crypto. Professionals just mess with the keys, which of course what they did with DigiNotar. They just messed with the keys. And we have lots of cases on the internet now where you think you have an encrypted connection end to end, but you don't because somebody's messed with the keys. And it's ugly. But that's one problem. The other problem is you connect to a website and it attacks you. You go to a website and it downloads JavaScript, and the JavaScript is malicious. It wants to download malware onto your computer. And there's a tension between those two challenges. And the way I explain this to non-technical audiences, and they get the point, is I say to them, well, look at your physical mail. Do you want somebody opening the mail on the way from you to me? And they say, no, nobody should open my mail. That's my private thing. And I say, wait a minute, what if it's got anthrax in it? Oh my God, I want somebody else to open it. And by the way, they should be in a hazmat suit and fully trained and all this kind of thing because I don't want them to get hurt. And so the question is, what you mean by security depends on what the threat is. But when you go to Washington, they say the internet's insecure, do something. Well, whose problem is it? Is it my problem as an internet architect? Is it Mr. Comcast as an internet service provider? And the answer is, the problems we have as a practical matter on the internet today, the malware you get, the email that's got bad attachments or is spam or something, or phishing or something like that, that's not a problem that the internet at the packet level can solve. You know, you put the packet in here, it comes out there. That space belongs to the application designers. And the applications we have on the internet today often create problems for you, not because somebody wrote bad code and it's got some technical flaw in it, but because they designed an application that has risky modalities by design. Delivery of JavaScript is not a mistake. And people say, why didn't you think about security? Why didn't you think about security? Damn it, I did think about security. When people started talking about downloading active code, JavaScript or Java or something like that, from a website, every security person I know was standing on the sideline saying, stupidest area, you're all going to die, it's a terribly stupid idea. And they did it anyway, because they love features. And we love features more than security until immediately after the breach, in which case we flip for 30 seconds and then we go back to loving features. So the question is, how do we teach application designers to do a better job of helping to protect you from the risky modalities that they put into the code because the features are so cool? And she writes about that in the back of the book, and I write about that in the book. And it's a really important point, because until you break security into actionable subcomponents, you're just talking about an aspiration, and let's all salute, and then let's get on with it. Is that fair?
Well, now I'm not going to ask you the question, why didn't you think about security? Right. But I have another question for you. So one of the ways that computer scientists sort of traditionally always teach computer security, if you've never been in a class where somebody's trying to teach you that, is with something called the CIA triad. And not in reference to the Central Intelligence Agency, but in reference to what we're often taught are kind of the three components: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we've had some versions of this conversation before, but I was sort of struck by it anew reading your book, the extent to which you really separate out security from availability. And you give availability its own chapter, and you sort of pay attention to it in its own right. And I want you to talk a little bit about kind of why you pull out that component and how you think about it in regard to security and also as its own thing.
Right. And in fact, I struggled with the question of whether I should pull availability out of the chapter, and out of the security chapter, because the CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I actually think availability is an underappreciated part of security, but we have many availability problems on the internet today that have nothing to do with security. So the question was, do I pull it out and talk about availability as a goal, and perhaps not emphasize how fully there is an A in that C and I and A, or put it into the chapter where it sort of got mushed. And I will actually tell you it moved back and forth twice. But let me make a point about availability. The early days of the internet, we had to seek advice about how to think about security. We didn't know how to think about security. I'm talking about 1975. And I'm walking around, and the only people we could find to talk to back then were NSA. And they were very clear. The security problem that they really cared about was disclosure control, because they were passing around classified information, and as they said, if it's gone, it's gone. So they had this focus on disclosure control, and that naturally feeds into a line of technical thinking which has to do with encryption. Now, back then we couldn't do encryption on the computer because the computer didn't have enough power to do it, so we had to put extra boxes on, all kind of weirdness. But this idea that I encrypt it, I send it to you, you decrypt it, nobody can see it in the middle, is a reasonably compelling idea. And so there's this idea that we're going to do a really good job of protecting you from disclosure control and well, if somebody changes the bits in your packet, I can't stop them from doing that because they're untrustworthy routers, but encryption will absolutely tell you that it happened, so it'll stop you cleanly. And so they said, well, a good day's work is when I keep you from doing a bad thing. And now we look at the internet in the current world, and people get these weird dialog boxes saying, this certificate may be out of date. It is possible you're being attacked. Do you want to continue? And all the users click yes. Okay, and it's not I mean, sometimes just the boxes are just so incomprehensible you have no idea what they mean. But the other answer is, well, okay, what choice did the software give you? Take a risk, a mild risk, a tiny risk, and get the work done, or totally stop. And I had an experience the other day, which I think is sort of the height of this. I've actually been writing code. This is really scary. Usually my grad students run away when I'm writing code, but I was writing code in Python, and I needed to download an update of a new module, or package, or whatever they call it. And so I went to you type the magic incantation, and I get this box on the screen that says, download blocked. The certificate that was used to sign this is invalid. It may be out of date. And that was the end of the conversation. They gave me no plan B. They gave me no choice. I suspect my security friends thought they'd done a good day's work, protecting me from an incredibly low probability attack. I claim they carried out a 100% successful attack on me along the dimension of availability. So in this respect, that A is absolutely critical as a counterbalance to C and I. And by the way, the cryptographers cannot help you with availability. But the reason I wrote about it in a separate chapter is that what we do if we want to think seriously about availability is at a very high level like a cartoon story, okay, which is if you want the system to be available, you have to be able to adjust what you are doing on the network so that you don't use the component that's attacking you. Well, that's sort of like good day's work, right? But if there's a router that's dropping your packets, route around it. Well, we don't give the user control over routing. We give that to the network. There are places where we actually do give the user some choice. You can go in, and this is not nearly an availability thing, you can go in and edit that list of certificates, the root certificates you trust. Anybody here even know that list existed in your computer? Yes, two people knew, but that list existed, sort of.
There's 3 of them.
3 of them. 5. There's another hand by 4. Okay, good. We'll get a few people here now. If you go to the domain name system and you look up a name and it won't give you the answer, it gives you the wrong answer, you can actually put in the address of a domain DNS server that you like. Anybody know the address of a domain name server?
8888.
Yeah, right. And if you can't remember 8.8.8.8, you can remember 4.4.4.4. And you can also do 9.9.9.9. They were all picked to be easy to remember, right? But when you are being subjected to an attack of the sort that I described, which is the security system has stopped you from making progress, you've got to have a plan B, and the plan B has to give some control to somebody you trust. And that applies both in the case of failures that are due to security attacks and failures due to sheer incompetence. So the reason I wrote a separate chapter is that in some sense, the response you take, although in the case of a malicious adversary may have to be a more crafty response, but philosophically it's the same sort of thing, which is you got to figure out what components are attacking you so you can stop using them. And if the network didn't give you enough control, then you're screwed. And on the other hand, if I give you control, then is it possible that malicious people will use that control as its own attack vector? So this is actually a very complicated design space. And as far as I'm concerned with respect to computer science and networking, it's an underappreciated one, and I wanted to give it visibility by promoting it to its own chapter.
So David, if I ruled the world for the next 10 years, which I assume is imminent, the things that I would most want to do for the internet 5-10 years out would mostly be around putting a lot more responsibility and a lot clearer responsibilities on certain groups of intermediaries online. Those would include the internet service providers who carry your traffic, and thinking about the kinds of security responsibilities they could carry most effectively, as well as the payment processors, the ad networks, software developers, hardware manufacturers. That would be sort of one of my big takeaways from working on this project, that's one of the more productive things we could do around security for the next 5-10 years. What would it be for you if you got to choose how we were going to redesign the internet for the not immediate future, but slightly longer term?
So I would agree with you at two levels. First of all, that in your answer you've given emphasis to security, which I think is a pressing issue. And secondly, that the path forward is to try to identify the proper responsibilities for the different actors and then understand how to incentivize them or corral them into a corner so that they'll take that action. And so in that respect, I would agree with you. And I'm obviously bringing up a particular aspect here, which I think we both agree about, which is I'd like to see the application designers be given, let's say, better guidance as to how to build applications that can help you modulate the behavior based on whether you trust the person you're talking to, distinguish, separate, be designed in such a way that it separates out malicious behavior from normal behavior, which is something you talk about in the book here. So I would say that is sort of a being more concrete example of what you're doing. I am worried, in addition to talking about security, about some very fundamental economic tensions in the internet, and I would like to see us work through those. And I said I'd say a little bit about economics, so I'll come back and I'll tell you a story. In the 1990s, well, I talked about this really simple service model of the internet, the best ever service model. You put a packet in here and it comes out there except when it doesn't. No guarantees about delay, no guarantees about bandwidth, no guarantees about the service quality. It's just we'll do the best we can. But we knew in the late 1980s, and yeah, we really did know in the 1980s that we were going to be doing telephony on the internet and streaming video on the internet. We did demonstrations of streaming video in the 1980s. When was the Rolling Stones concert broadcast? Was that 1992 or 1993? One of the first videos, the live streaming broadcast on the internet was the Rolling Stones, except there was this garage band out of Xerox Park called Severe Tire Damage. And they said, we're not going to let the Rolling Stones go first. So they did a live streaming concert. So Severe Tire Damage gets the credit for the first live streaming video on the internet. But in order to make video work, we realized that maybe the video needed better quality of service, as we call it. Maybe we ought to give them some bandwidth commitments or some latency commitments so that the video actually works. Because if you have variation in latency delivering your email, who cares? If you have variation in delivering your web page, you care but a little bit, you won't really notice. But the streaming goes to hell and you get little spinning things and all kind of bad stuff happens. So we spent the first part of the 90s designing quality of service mechanisms. And for those of you who are geeky, we designed something called diffserv, and we designed something called intserv, and it was cool mechanisms. And I went to Cisco, and I said, hey, Cisco, you got to put this stuff on the router. And Cisco said, well, I put stuff on a router when you have a customer. Find me a customer. So, okay, I'll go do your job for you. So I went to the CTO of then largest wide area internet service provider, and I said, hey, because I knew this guy, I said, this quality of stuff is really cool. You ought to put it in your network and turn it on. And he said, no. I like simple answers, but that was the wrong one. And I said, why? And I got this wonderful sentence. This and two other sentences summarize an entire decade of understanding for me. He said, why should I spend a lot of money putting quality of service in my network so Bill Gates can make a lot of money selling internet telephony for Windows? And I said, this actor spends the money, this actor makes the money, there's a dislocation here. So this conversation, I documented in the book, and the other conversation I documented in the book was another very short one with a famous economist, and he said to me, David, you got to understand something. He said, the internet is about routing money, and routing packets is a side effect, and you screwed up the money routing protocols. And I said, what do you mean? I didn't design any money routing protocols. And he said, that's what I said. So if you have Mr., I would say today, Mr. Comcast, say, I don't want to pick on them except they're the biggest, and you have Mr. Google, the question is, should Mr. Google give Mr. Comcast some money in exchange for carrying their traffic? Or should they say, no, 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 I'm paid by the edge customers, I'm paid by the guy at the edge, you know, the consumers pay for me, I'll just carry anybody's traffic, and there's this really valuable stuff flowing over the network, valuable in the sense the consumer loves it, but I'm not attaching anything to that value stream. Well, it shouldn't surprise you that these guys want to see if they can figure out how to monetize that stream. And we're going to fight over money, and we're fighting over that money in all kinds of ways right now that I find very, in some cases, disquieting, and in some cases, very unstable. So we have debates about network neutrality. Okay, everybody knows that phrase, network neutrality. Oh, God, okay. That's actually not what I'm scared about. Violation of network neutrality is not what scares me, but I'll tell you what does scare me. But the hypothesis is that somehow big players like Comcast will go to somebody like Netflix and say, hey, Netflix, my customers think you're really valuable, so you've got to pay me a premium to get your traffic across my network because I think I can get away with it. And this has been said to me in almost those terms, not by American ISPs, but some European ISPs said that. They literally said to me, I said, well, what about Google? And they said, well, they have a lot of money, I'd like some. I mean, that was the business model. I said, okay, whoa, what happened there? So how are they going to try to tax the content that's being sent? Well, what they're actually doing today, and you alluded to this, for the last few years, the Federal Communications Commission burdened ISPs with a particular regulatory regime called Title II. Don't worry about it, but it's a part of the law. And as a part of Title II, they were subjected to very severe regulations about privacy. The current administration has reversed that ruling. The Chairman Pai of the FCC said, no, that was all wrong. And all the consumer advocates assumed, oh, well, we're now going to see violations of network neutrality. No, that's not what we're going to see. What we now see is the ISPs going full tilt boogie into the business of looking at everything you're doing so that they can translate it into demographic profiling so that they can sell your information for advertising. And I think people underestimate how enthusiastic the ISPs are to join in this process of looking at everything you do. Now, of course, one answer is, why don't you just encrypt it, please? Okay, just turn on encryption. But the flip side to this is that the advertising ecosystem only has so much money in it. The amount of money being spent on internet advertising in the United States, which is about $80 billion, has just, which sounds like a lot, right, has just exceeded the amount of money spent on traditional television advertising. So if we could steal every advertising dollar in the world, we're only going to get about a factor of 2. And after that, we're just fighting over constant dollars because advertising can only grow at the rate of commerce because companies only spend a certain fraction of their top line on advertising. So who's getting most of that money right now? And the answer is Facebook and Google are getting over 50% of it, and the dregs are left for everybody else. So how do we stabilize what I would call the free internet experience? And people are trying desperately to do a better job of learning everything about you to be the one who can make the money out of this. And I think this is as upsetting to me because it is leading to so many distortions of the ecosystem. I would just like Comcast to carry my traffic, for God's sake. Okay, I don't want them to look at it. I don't want them to prioritize it, unless I'm watching video, in which case, yeah, if you want to prioritize the video traffic, that's fine. But I think there is an instability in the ecosystem that is leading to people trying to create what I will call ad hoc money routing protocols. And one of the things I talk about in the book is maybe it's time to design some money routing protocols. So in addition to security, which I completely agree with, I would probably think about how to improve the economic stability and viability of the ecosystem.
Well, I have lots more questions, but now that we've brought up net neutrality, I feel like we should give other people a chance.
Yeah, it's time. We've talked too long, so we should let you ask some questions or make statements, right? Does anybody wish to make a statement from the floor? Right?
All right. Why is encryption not the answer to the issue you just brought up about Comcast looking at my traffic?
Encryption
I know the answer, but I want to hear from you.
Well, I think encryption of your traffic is a fine answer.
Right.
And there's a movement on the internet to make it easy. I mean, you can't as an individual do this. You have to make sure the website you go to help you turn on encryption and so forth. There are organizations that generate a backlash if we try to encryption, and there are two very different organizations that generate backlash. One of them is national security organizations who get a little upset when they can't see anything. they talk about, oh, the internet's going dark, we're all going to die. I said, no, 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 no. In fact, my friends in the NSA are not that pessimistic. No, they say, what a little gray. We know how to look at it. How do they look at it? They mess with the keys. And the other people who are getting upset are the mobile guys who say, I need to be able to see what you're doing so that I can transform it to deal with the technical limitations of the mobile channel so I can give you a great experience, and would you stop encrypting it? So there's some tensions there. But in general, I would say that's a lame excuse. And NSA said they're only going gray, so I'm absolutely in favor of saying, yeah, by default, we should just be encrypting everything.
So why is that not the answer to that question?
Well, I think it is, but we're not there. Right? We gotta, and key management is the real problem in that space.
Right now, of course, encryption is only going to obscure what's in the packet. It's not going to obscure where the packets are going to.
Oh yeah, I think there are a lot of problems encryption doesn't solve. I think it's fair to say that it solves that particular issue of ISPs collecting information to show you ads.
There are how much I'm going to Twitter and how much I'm going to Google and so on.
That's right.
Absolutely.
But since everybody today spends all their time talking to Facebook, they know the answer before they look. Yeah, way in the back there. Hi.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up to that question. Going back to your comments regarding messing with the keys, I recently read that Google employees, they use this Ubico keys to actually encrypt their laptops. And apparently Google has officially stated that there has been no incident in Google Enterprise among employees while they're using the Ubico key as a way of authenticating their identity. So this kind of brings up the question of, should everyone start using Ubico keys to go over that issue of confidentiality and just focus on the key management issue? And the other thing that I want to actually kind of relate to this is I want to bring up is the second side of A. When we look at the CIA, it's not just availability, right? There's also this thing called authenticity. Is the person that I'm talking to really the person that I'm talking to? That's not integrity of data, that's not confidentiality, that's also authenticity. Because the middleman, you never know who he is. How is all of these related to each other? Like,
you want to talk about two-factor authentication?
I do. I'm glad you brought up that announcement. So
I thought you would.
I do some work on two-factor authentication, and one of the things I've always been fascinated by is, Google has been providing two-factor authentication to people who want it for more than 10 years, and they have never made any public statement or released any public data about how effective it is, which is sort of remarkable, right? That if you look through the literature on two-factor authentication, we actually have no idea how effective it is at driving down account compromises. And the only statement they've made, which they made quite recently, which you brought up, is that they switched from having all of their employees in-house at Google using in-app two-factor, which, say, if you use Duo for any of your accounts, is probably what most of you use. You get a little notification on your phone that says, check here if this is really you trying to log on.
MIT
They switched from that to giving everybody at Google a physical key to use instead as their second factor. And that was when they finally made a public announcement that said, we haven't seen any account compromises since we made this switch. So I read that announcement, I say, well, something was really not working with the in-app two-factor authentication, it sounds like. If you had, so, I mean, I think from a security standpoint, it's possible there's a lot of really good empirical data somewhere that I haven't quite been able to get my hands on that makes exactly that case. To say if you're going to go to all of this trouble of doing two-factor, you should actually be spending a little more money. And the reason we mostly don't do it is if you, who here uses Duo? Are people familiar with that name? Oh, everybody now. Excellent. Right, so if you use Duo, then if you're using those in-app notifications, that's going to cost your institution, which is paying Duo for this service, probably on average about $1 to $2 a year. If you're using the physical key, that's going to be a $25 charge for that key. So it's just a question of sort of what's the most cost-efficient form of key management from Duo's perspective. I think you're right that we would all be more secure if we were all carrying around a little physical key, but we haven't gotten there yet. And again, I'm speculating wildly based on that announcement, right? Because there's so little data available in this space about what's the most effective form of authentication and how secure it is.
There's a dimension to security we haven't talked about here. I'll come back to the second half of your question, which is how do you make this system so they're actually usable? And a YubiKey is fine until you lose it. And I've actually been in a situation where my YubiKey stopped working. Okay, but MIT gave me a backup, and the backup was the Duo app on my phone. So the point is, if I have all of these capabilities, has that degraded the security of two-factor authentication because I've got so many modalities which I have put in order to make it usable in case of reality, like I lost the phone, I lost the YubiKey, whatever it is. So I think, again, usability is underappreciated, and it's a systems problem, it's not a crypto problem. Let me just to say, with respect to your second question, that, yeah, in the first lecture in security, we talk about CIA, but there are other things we talk about, and authenticity, repudiation, all of these things are absolutely important parts of this. And you need to have sufficient confidence either in who you're talking to or who the creator of the information was or something about provenance that you're confident you're getting the thing that you expected to be getting. If you get the New York Times, is it actually the New York Times as opposed to a rogue version of it? Now, what we do on the internet today is a little sloppy, which is we say, well, the reason you're getting the real New York Times is I made sure that the website you went to is the one that's run by the New York Times, and since you went to the website that belongs to the New York Times, you'll get the real one. But of course that means you can't cache the copy anyplace, because if you go someplace else to get it, well, that's a fake. That's not the real one. So wouldn't it be nice if the New York Times had a way of signing the New York Times, which is different than signing or giving us assurance about the communication channel, so that no matter where I got the New York Times, even if I got it from your laptop, I knew it was the real one. And again, this is a rather complicated design space with a lot of dimensions and a lot of issues of usability and a lot of tensions between actors. There are people who would like to be able to cache content. Some of the proposals for a new internet architecture have to do with caching content ubiquitously anywhere on the internet. They require that all content be signed to verify its authenticity, which means you have to know the public key of the creator of the content. But I didn't go to the creator of the content to get the content because I got it from a cache, so how do I know who they are? You have to think through all of these issues, and again, these are areas where we need to have good design patterns so that application designers don't do something stupid. Some more questions? I'm sorry, I can't point straight. Forgive me. Yeah, yes, you. Yeah. I've never.
What role do you see quantum computing? What role, if any, do you see quantum computing playing in the future of cybersecurity and in?
You want to say something about quantum, or you?
I have a lot to say. I think there are people who know much more about this than I do. It changes the cryptography problems pretty dramatically, and in ways that we're probably not totally ready to deal with in the crypto world. I don't know, I haven't thought a lot about how it changes some of the questions of who's well poised to do security, which is a lot of what I spend my time thinking about. Probably it does sort of shuffle that calculus a little bit, but it's going to depend a lot on who's developing and manufacturing the quantum computers and what that sort of industry is going to look like, which I think we don't have a very clear picture
We
of
actually
yet.
do have a data point in this space because NIST has been studying, in particular, the risks of quantum computing to encryption. And I think they have said that they think we have 10 years to develop new crypto algorithms that are resistant to quantum attacks. And there are some thoughts about how to do it. There's actually some work being funded in this area. So NIST has actually decided that it's time to take action, and they are. And as I said, I'm not a cryptographer. I'm certainly not a quantum cryptographer. Talk about breaking your brain, but it just makes my head hurt to think about it. But there are people who, and I've had a couple briefings on how you would design crypto algorithms that are resistant to quantum attacks, and NIST has said, we got to start working on it now because we only have 10 years. So maybe it's 15, but it's not forever. They think it's real. Come on, got to be some other victim out there. Okay, Nathaniel. Another one of my grad students here finally stuck his hand up.
But actually, this is a question for Josephine. Given all the case studies that you looked into, and sort of the fact that a lot of places, states in the U.S., places like the European Union are trying to make laws about data breaches now, and sort of what companies have an obligation to do in the aftermath, and how soon they should notify people and so on. Do you see those as being effective, or are they causing maybe more harm than they intended in the first place, or what's your sort of thought on legislating responsibility?
don't think we've seen anybody do it very well yet. I think the sort of initial set of data breach notification laws, which we get mostly in the early 2000s, are helpful in that they're how we learn about data breaches, right? You couldn't study the kinds of things I study if every company, every time it had a data breach, never told anyone about it. So I think from a policy standpoint, that's helpful because it means you know when your data's been stolen and you can do whatever it is you do to protect yourself. In many cases at this point, that may be nothing. But I think that what we're seeing now in sort of the next wave is very punitive, poorly targeted policy. So if you take something like the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, which imposes fines of up to 4% of a company's revenue for security breaches, which is, I mean, really a sort of astonishing number if you think about some of these big tech companies. I'm actually someone who believes it's, good to think about incentives and to think about whether these breaches cost enough money for the people who are in a position to do a better job protecting against them. But I don't think that is a sort of well-considered way of trying to place incentives. I don't think it's a number that comes from anywhere meaningful. And so I'm not very hopeful about this particular generation of punitive policies. I think what's going to be interesting to see is how they're implemented, right? So that 4% fine is a cap. I would be astonished if we saw any of the European data commissioners actually imposing that on any of the major tech companies. I think there could be some backfiring here. I feel that most strongly when I actually go to Europe and I get the pop-up messages now about, all of your data is being collected, click here, and then you click on another article that says all of your data is being collected again, right? And you start to feel like you will never do anything online again. And the other thing that makes me very pessimistic, I'll just say, I was in Germany for a week this past summer talking with some of their policymakers about GDPR, and I think when you talk to some of the policymakers who are thinking about whether this policy is working and how they're measuring it as effective, a lot of what they're doing is they're measuring how many of those little pop-up messages people are clicking through. And they're saying, look, we've educated 9 million people today about their privacy, and that was a really effective policy, right? That's their metric. And I think that's a very, very, very bad metric to be using to say, is this a policy that's working or is this not a policy that's working? So I'm not super optimistic about sort of this particular incarnation. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in states now that are sort of going down this path is modeling policy on those GDPR standards, which makes sense because there's not a whole lot else to use as a template. But I'm hopeful for a sort of post-GDPR generation of policymaking.
She has a chapter titled Reasonable Security. And I think that's a mushy but very important question. What's enough? What's good enough? And you point out that some breaches in the United States have led to punitive fines and some haven't. They looked at it and said, yeah, you got hacked, but you actually did a pretty good job. So, that was good enough. And it's an interesting question. Should you spend more money to protect yourself than you think on average you're going to lose in a breach? We spend a lot more money on defense. So, the major cost of security today is the money spent by the defenders, not the losses. I think we have time for one more question. I don't see anybody back there scowling at me. They said we wanted to stop more or less at 7, and it's more or less 7. So we can take a final question, and then we'll quit. Sandra, was that you back there?
No, if you have.
No, you go ahead.
No, I'm a ringer, so.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, what's going on in the back of the room there?
So, a
Sandra.
question for Josephine. So, one of the fascinating things about your book was your distinction among processes by the motive that was driving them. Can you say something about what led you to that and how you think that kind of dimension can enter the policy space?
Sure. So when I started working on these cases, one of the first things I did was I spent a lot of time trying to map out every single step from, as early as we knew about the espionage attempts to carrying out the entire breach to monetizing the stolen data. And I came away feeling like if you're thinking about policy defenses, which is a lot of what I think about, then what really matters are sort of those final stages of a breach when whoever intruded in your system or compromised your system in some way does what it is they were ultimately trying to do, whether that's reading the Gmail accounts of people in Iran, or stealing all of your money, or embarrassing you in a very global way by posting all of your emails online or your Ashley Madison account information or whatever else, that what really mattered for policymakers, and not necessarily for application designers, is what is it somebody's going to try to do after they've gotten access to the computer systems they wanted to access. So that's why I organize it that way, and I talk about financially motivated breaches, where you've got a lot of tools, because one of the things policymakers are really good at and governments are really good at is tracking money and putting certain kinds of restrictions on money, especially when it's not cryptocurrency money. And then I talk about espionage incidents. And again, that starts to get harder, because once you've gotten into the computer system and you've gotten access to information, the question of what can you do at that point to stop somebody from conducting espionage is pretty restricted, right? We see the United States do some things after, say, the OPM breach. They take some of their spies out of China, who they think their identities will now be compromised. So there are certain things you can do to make it harder to act on that information, but there's not the same opportunity to say we're going to prevent them from making money by canceling all your credit cards or something like that. And then I also talk about breaches that I sort of call public humiliation breaches, things like Sony Pictures or Ashley Madison, where the people who perpetrate them aren't directly looking to make money, aren't exactly looking to conduct espionage for political purposes, but really want to kind of embarrass or create chaos for the people who they're breaching. And there, I argue, there are sort of really controversial policy options that you can look at around restricting information. And we saw some of this after the Sony Pictures breach. People saying, you know, the news outlets who are publicizing this stolen information should be punished, because they're the ones who are really helping the attackers carry out their ultimate mission of making Sony Pictures' life a living hell. And those are very, very tricky kinds of policy proposals if you live in a country like the United States, where there are very strong free speech and freedom of the press protections. But I think that sort of what policies are useful and what you can do if you accept that some of the computer systems are always going to be vulnerable, especially to state actors, and what can you do after the fact, really depends on that question of what's motivating the attack. And that's why I organize them that way in the book.
May as well stop it
Time to stop?
there. Thank you.